Me karakia tātou, ko te tai whakarunga, ko te tai whakararo, ko te tai tokoro, ko te tai tonga, ko te tai hoauru, ko te tai rāwhiti, tēnei, ko te tai ohanga, hui e, tae ki e. Kia ora koutou, ko Tim Hampton aho. I am the Director Economic System here at Treasury, and it's wonderful to have people both here in person and online, and I know many of you have been sitting through a full range of presentations up at NZAE, and so I think this is a really good round out as well. To really pleased to have David Vines here to finish off the week. And so in terms of the, first of all, a few things on the health and safety side of things. In the first case, if there's an earthquake, drop, I'm way off guard. Basically, get down and look after yourself. In the event of a fire alarm, please follow Treasury staff, just not me, because I'm clearly not as across it as everyone else. But yes, drop, cover and hold, and wait for stay in the building until further instruction. Bathrooms can be found just out here and through the door just to the right of the mini kitchenette. This is the second seminar in the latest round of Treasury guest lectures, and this theme for this series is fiscal policy for the future. This theme will explore the role of stabilising, sustainable and effective fiscal policy. We chose this theme as a focus for our series because sustainability and resilience is essential to maintain and raise the living standards for all New Zealanders. Speakers throughout the series will provide insights into how fiscal policy can be designed to support government to meet its current and future obligations, while adapting and changing circumstances and delivering value to the New Zealand public. Just as a small plug, the Treasury last week published a consultation document on our topic for the long-term insights briefing. And so this is a 3-year publication. It is a public servant document. It is not a ministerial document. It is our opportunity to really do analysis and put forward our thoughts. The topic that we're focusing on in the consultation document is sustainable and resilient fiscal policy over economic cycles. And so the consultation document is basically saying, okay, that's the general topic that we're wanting to look into, and it talks through the different questions that we intend answering. We're not answering the questions at this stage. It's just getting the public's view on essentially the scope and the approach we're taking to the insights briefing. So encourage everybody to have a look at that, and responses on that are due by Friday the 26th of July. So still another 3 weeks to look at that. But moving on to today, let me introduce David, who I'm thrilled to have with us today. David is Emeritus Professor of Economics and Emeritus Fellow of Balliol College at Oxford University. He's also the Director of Ethics and Economics Program at the Institute for New Economic Thinking in the Oxford Martin School, and a Research Fellow of the Centre for Economic Policy Research in London. David's research is on macroeconomics, finance, and global economic governance. He's currently writing about international economic cooperation, the reconstruction of macroeconomic theory in the wake of the COVID pandemic, welcome, Dr. Bloomfield, and macroeconomic policy making in Australia. David's publications in the last decade include The Leaderless Economy and Keynes' Useful Economics for the World Economy, both written jointly with Peter Temin of MIT, and Capital Failure, Restoring Trust in Financial Services, which he edited with Nicholas Morris. David is a joint editor of another issue of OxRep, published last month, that examines the changing world order and global economic governance. Today, David will traverse the development of global economic governance since the Second World War and the implications for the future of liberal internationalisation in the world economic order. I don't know whether we'll be talking about the UK election as those results start rolling in as well.
All the early results are really...
Yes. The evolution of global economic governance is critical for a small open economy in New Zealand. As we know, New Zealand is critically dependent on, sustainability of world trading system. And so anything that starts to challenge that is of critical interest to us. Recognising shifts in global governance aids in anticipating changes in trade, investment and financial systems, thereby informing robust and resilient fiscal strategies that can navigate an increasingly uncertain international landscape. As I say, understanding these trends is vital for New Zealand and the long-term well-being of New Zealanders. In terms of how we're going to run the session, so David's going to stand up and speak for about 40 minutes, and then that'll be followed by open discussion. So all up, we're here through until 3 o'clock. So with no further ado, I welcome David Vines to the podium. Thank you.
Let me just make sure I understand this properly to start with. I'm looking there, that's that, and backwards, and there's and I don't do any pointing with the screen, do I? And I don't need to. So there we are. This is a spin out, this lecture, from the enterprise which I've been engaged in fairly full time for the last year and a half, editing an issue of the Oxford Review of Economic Policy on global economic governance, and let you into a secret that I said about 3 years ago to my fellow editors of the Oxford Review of Economic Policy. I've had enough listening to international relations scholars using big words, talking about neoliberalism and instrumentalism and securitization and liberal internationalism. And you know what? I'm going to take 5 or 6 of those guys and lock them up in a room, and they're not allowed out until they'll have a discussion about whether the exchange rate should go up or down, or the tariff rate should be adjusted in a particular way. And you'll see that through what I've got to say today. Those guys talk about big regime questions in a way which actually turns out, when you sit down and think carefully, particularly with our background, is extraordinarily revealing. And we as a profession do the opposite. Should there be a floating exchange rate in these particular circumstances? Yes or no, particular careful analytical model. And I hope you'll see in what I've got to say some attempt to bring the big picture and the particular details together. As my first slide says, 4 bits to the talk. First, some history, locating this discussion, going right back to essentially Bretton Woods. Secondly, thinking about the nature of international global governance. And you'll see I've got something to say about how to think about that perhaps is not the normal prisoner's dilemma way of thinking about governance problems. Thirdly, I'm going to talk about contemporary challenges, and you'll see how I already know how important they are. And finally, I'll wrap up with that observation I've already made about the complementary insights that you get from IR and international economics. I was very fortunate to get into this kind of world and work when I was asked to referee the 3rd volume of Skidelsky's Life of Keynes, and that's 2000, so it's nearly a quarter of a century ago. And I'd had the privilege of working as a PhD student and then as a postdoc with James Mead, who worked very closely with Keynes in the run-up to Bretton Woods, and then in the great book, The Balance of Payments in 1951, which essentially wrote down the understandings that they'd got from Bretton Woods. And it was clear to me that Skidelsky, although he'd written a wonderful book, hadn't really understood the economics. And so I started with a request to the Economic Journal, could I write a longer review than normal? They were then about 900 words, double that. And somewhat later, I delivered 10,000 words because I'd essentially tried to understand the economic underpinnings of what it was that third stage of Keynes's life, Skidelsky's third volume, from the general theory to Bretton Woods, was all about. And here's a summary of what I learned. And I look back to what I said a minute ago about international relations scholars. There are some very interesting things written by particularly John Eikenberry about the origins of the post-war liberal international order and how it arose and why it was sustained. And not John, I exempt him from this, but many of these IR scholars have obviously not even done Econ 101. And my claim to nearly all of them is that if you want to build a liberal international order, then basically you have to do what's on this blackboard. And if what my talk is going to be what's on this blackboard going wrong, and that the crisis of the liberal international order, as seen by IR scholars analysing their big international regime story, is really about stuff we know about open economy, macro and trade. And you'll be able to see from that picture the four components of this regime that was established at Bretton Woods and then at the conference in, I want to say Geneva in 47, when was an attempt to set up the International Trade Organization, which of course the US vetoed, but which turned into the GATT. So it's the IMF, World Bank and the GATT. And the first line is, if you like, Keynes' general theory, full employment, commitment, and what IR scholars talk about, embedded liberalism, is a commitment to the world being made well for all of us, which is a political economy way of thinking about the general theory and its full employment objective. But secondly, it is the second most important, that's a bad sentence. The second important thing in this diagram is the preservation of external balance of payments equilibrium, and not by means of austerity or not by means of tariff protection, but by means of some kind of, in those days, fixed but adjustable exchange rate system, and a requirement to invent an international organization to manage this, which is what happened at Bretton Woods with the establishment of the IMF. And long story, when I turned up in Britain as a graduate student in 1972, there was still endless discussion about the first row of this of this diagram, that wonderful phrase, stop, go. You would have a fiscal expansion, and of course then you run into balance of payments deficit, and then you reverse the fiscal expansion, and that's how you manage macro policy. It wasn't very clever. And I'd learned how not to do this from the Swan diagram already, because I'd been taught it as an undergraduate, as had everybody in New Zealand as well, in understanding. And that's the great work that Trevor Swan did in taking those ideas of James Mead, which in turn wrote down Bretton Woods. So the first two lines of that are most of Bretton Woods, but the third line is the preservation of international financial stability, which in those days was just capital controls. But it was an insurance that more than that, there was to be a World Bank and a regime which would deliver external borrowing, lending to emerging market economies to enable export-led growth in the catch-up parts of the world. And fourthly, although it took 3 years to get organised and not have the ITO, but in the end get the GATT, was a commitment to a regime which enabled this regime of every emerging market economy and indeed the advanced West having export-led growth with a regime which encouraged openness of international trade, and that there would be an organisation which ultimately has become the ITO, has become the World Trade Organization, to manage that. Now, the other things that I say on this slide, part of the history which I don't want to spend a long time on, is just that these discussions were initially provoked after the meeting by Keynes, on my brain, by Churchill and Roosevelt in August 1941, which led to the Atlantic Charter and a statement of the post-war objectives for a free, open world. It's worth reading still, because much of it could be copy-pasted into an agenda for the middle of the 21st century. But when the negotiations between the declining hegemon, Britain, and the emerging hegemon, the US, began, it was clear that the objectives differed radically. The purpose of the US was already enshrined in Article 7 of the Lend-Lease Treaty, which involved the deconstruction of imperial preference and basically the removal of the privileged status of the British Empire, coupled with a determination by Harry Dexter White to create an international monetary system that was well enough managed to avoid the obvious possibility of an excess burst of global liquidity and the post-World War I problems of the world economy. He was facing the British, who on the side of trade wanted not just to preserve the empire, but thank you very much to have access into a determinedly protectionist US market, much discussion there, and on the macro side, to have a world economy that was what's the word I want? Capable of supporting an expansionary end to that period after the Second World War, rather than the collapse of the international macro system which had happened after the First World War. And you can argue that the resolution which happened at Bretton Woods and subsequently, more or less settled somewhere in between what the declining hegemon and the growing hegemon wanted. And the British Empire was dismembered as a trading system, but only very, very slowly as a result of the trade rounds in the managed by the GATT, and only as a result of there being correlated concessions and liberalizations and openings made by the US. And on the macrofinance side, an outcome which would make possible full employment policies in countries which were not in balance of payments crisis difficulties, enough international liquidity, but not too much. That's my story of how and where we got to where we were with the post-war order. And you will see this chart pursuing me as I continue with this lecture, as I alter various bits of it. This picture which I've depicted was the institutional framework which underpinned the Golden Age, which ran until 1971, which the French had their wonderful alternative name, the Trente Glorieux, the glorious 30 years, meant the same thing. But by the end of the 60s, there was an inflation threat domestically, and there was a speculative attack on the quasi-fixed exchange rate system, meaning that neither unmanaged, undisciplined full employment policies nor quasi-fixed exchange rates could be sustained. But you can argue that what emerged, which Max Corden wonderfully called a non-system, was in fact still a system. What I've done in yellow is describe the new bits that replaced the old bits. There they are, the old bits. And now full employment gives way to inflation targeting, and peg but adjustable exchange rates gives rise to floating exchange rates, providing there's sufficient domestic discipline. But there's still the same institutional structure to manage it. And my view of the non-system, which in the end I think Max and many others agreed with, was that although it was not the Bretton Woods system, it was a system and sufficiently powerful in constraining the workings of the global economy that it provided the basis for the Great Moderation. And you can regard what happened during the Great Moderation as nearly as wonderful as what happened during the Golden Age. Except that, as we all know, one sentence, excuse me, you need to regulate the financial system properly, and they didn't. But you can write down how a two-country or end-country symmetrical or asymmetrical version of this world would work. And I used to teach my graduate students, just imagine you sat on the moon and tried to imagine the perfect world. This sort of thing could be imagined to be a stabilization system that could manage the universe, roughly speaking, in dealing with really quite significant shocks. We're not happy anymore, and I'm going to be talking about why in the third part of my talk. But in the second part of my talk, I want to ask ourselves what was actually going on during this managed regime. What was the governance that these institutions on the right-hand side of my picture were actually, let's just say, cooperating in managing? And the IR scholars, in a way, led the way with this. I learned game theory long ago, and I learned about Axelrod and repeated. And first of all, as an undergraduate, a zillion years ago, I was taught the prisoner's dilemma. It was quite new then in the late 60s, and we all know it, and we all know that the equilibrium is default and cheat. And we all know that Axelrod was wonderful in showing that if there's a future, then the promise of, for example, embedded in tit for tat, can keep the cooperative equilibrium alive. And that was the analysis that the IR scholars set about applying to their big mega regime stories. They said, roughly speaking, everywhere you look at this picture that I've described, there's all sorts of free riding opportunities, but somehow or other, the threat of it unraveling is sufficiently dangerous as to cause everyone to want to cooperate in keeping this many-dimensional prisoner's dilemma alive. What's the word I want? In the cooperative equilibrium. And 5-10 years later, economists produced prisoner's dilemma arguments about, first of all, trade, that what's the WTO? It's a solution to a prisoner's dilemma problem. Everyone wants to be protectionist for reasons to do with domestic political economy. But if they all get together in a not very successful meeting in Seattle or wherever, they will be able to trade enough with each other in promises to keep alive cooperation and propel forward the rounds of trade liberalisation. And I became a graduate student. I vividly remember this because it helped me get my first professorial job, explaining this model to a rather brutally aggressive interview panel, understanding the macroeconomics of policy coordination. In those days, the model that was being paraded was Thatcher wants to do anti-inflation policy by raising the interest rate. That'll appreciate the exchange rate, bring in lower inflation home to Britain and export inflation to the rest of the world. But Ronald Reagan will do the same. And this is a Nash equilibrium, and there'll be lots of unemployment as they each try and do this. And the cooperative equilibrium is to look each other in the eye and say, don't be stupid, we can cooperate with the macro strategy. And all around me were me and my friends writing our PhD theses on these prisoner's dilemma models of that sort of stuff. But it's not very persuasive. And Max Corden was the person who said to me, come on, David, this is not the IMF. This is after he'd had a year there. He said to me, David, everywhere you look, there are free riding opportunities. And can you imagine this jumbled mixture of international summits producing credible promises which people are really committed to keeping? And he then proceeded to say to me, I've had a year at the IMF, and I think the IMF is basically a Rolodex. And his point was, it was a telephone directory for the most promising, and I'm sure lots of people on that wall there, those great secretaries of the Treasury, many of them, part of their career was a time in an international organisation as they gained international connections. It's the Australian story and the British story. And that's what Max meant, learning to cooperate with personal networks. But the prisoners said, sorry, mate, this won't do as a way of thinking about the international regime, he said. And it's really Ross Garnaut who's persuaded me that there's another way of thinking about this. What he calls concerted unilateralism. And you'll see it turn up in other parts of my talk. But I'm going to explain it, first of all, with APEC. And this is Ross never quite wrote down this model in this, all right, brutally. Ross was never quite as clear as this in articulating the basic idea. But this is his idea, and we agree on it. Just suppose you have two protectionist members of the Asia-Pacific region contemplating whether to do a bilateral agreement on trade liberalisation. Don't invent the whole structure of APEC. Just consider Australia and Malaysia trying to have a conversation. And Australia can be home and Malaysia can be foreign. And we set the zeros at protect as we go into the game. And home faces Malaysia being protect. And it wants to argue whether it should go from protect to liberalise. So I'm in the right-hand column, and for Australia, I'm discussing whether to go up to the first row from naught. And of course, Econ 101, which we teach our undergrads, say, well, of course, you just liberalise. Don't you understand those why can't I find the word? Little triangle boxes of distortions. And in a competitive model with sensible whatever, everyone will want to do free trade. And we know that the basic political economy of why that isn't the case is some story about preferential political treatment for import competing industries. Just imagine that that's working strongly in this imaginary Australia. Of course, exporters would do better if we liberalised, but that's completely overruled by the loss to importers who count a lot. And that's why you get -4 for Australia if you go up like that. Of course, Australia isn't zero, so it is a bit important to Malaysia, and Malaysia gets +1 as a result of doing this. Similarly, if you think about Malaysia wondering whether to move along the horizontal line on the bottom row from protect to liberalise when Australia is protecting, exactly the same argument applies. Malaysia wants to remain protectionist, and if only they'd liberalise, Australia would get a bit, and that's the +1 there. And if they both liberalise, well, it's better than -4 in each country, but it's not wonderful. And there's only the two of them, and there's all the rest of this imaginary APEC, and there's a whole of the rest of the world out there. And this liberalising isn't a good idea, and that's your circumstance. So says Ross Garnaut, just suppose that you send, no, I won't caricature this, but I'm tempted to. You send Bob Hawke to Seoul to give a speech, which Garnaut and the people write about how wonderful APEC would be, and you start having meetings. And instead of 2 countries doing this, there are 16 countries or 12 or however many. Well, then the benefits to all doing it together are so much larger than if just one other country does it with you. So I'm just going to ask you to invent some imaginary arithmetic. If you just look at the top left-hand corner and start counting, supposing you make each of those entries +6. Why did I get +6? Well, I've created a circumstance with multiple equilibria. In those circumstances, there's nothing wrong with protect as an equilibrium. But if everybody liberalises, they all get so much benefit because their export sectors have been so advantaged that even though you've got to fix and do deals with your import competing sectors, this is not now a prisoner's dilemma. This is a model with 2 Nash equilibria. And that's the argument that's going to pervade all of what the rest that I'm saying. And it's developed with Ross's, this is where it came from, Ross's APEC story, but it's perfectly general in its application. And I was privileged to participate in helping background discussions when Australia was chair of the G20 in 2014. And I began having phone conversations with people about what, and you'll remember there'd just been the election of a liberal, that's to say right-wing government who were in favour of austerity, and Hockey was a austerity treasurer. And everyone knew that the world economy wasn't growing fast enough. And everyone knew that what it needed was fiscal expansion. That's to say us, the people in the background. And no individual country was prepared. Some were, but many, like Australia, had made promises at home and weren't prepared to move in this direction. What a careful chronology of what happened during that year in Australia's chair was very interesting. How much expansion would we need everybody to do? Let's put it through the IMF macro model and ask to, let's make up some number, and the number, let's do 2 years, over 5 years, we want the world economy to be 2% bigger. And 2 in 5 became the slogan. Now, how do you drum up Hockey to this game doing something that's the opposite of what he's promised? You end up saying not only everybody else doing it, But what's more, because everyone else is doing it, there will be +2, and +2 will generate more fiscal revenues for you. And you'll actually like doing this. And you see, I've created in that circumstance this two equilibria Nash. Stay put is one equilibrium, but move is the other. And you can go round circumstances of international cooperation with this mindset, which Garneau has. Why concerted? Because you agree on the rules of the game. You have your APEC meeting, you decide with, only people allowed into this room are people who are going to play this game. Only people who are allowed to come back to the next meeting in Canberra about the G20 have to. We don't care what they do. This isn't very detailed enforcement mechanism. Just come and show us that you're going to do something, and we'll add them all up. Is something enough? Actually, had to do it more. You can see the story I'm telling, and that's a very different story from the Nash equilibrium story. That's my piece of theory. Now let's go back to the picture of the world that I described before and ask ourselves what's gone wrong now. The yellow stuff is to remind you what went wrong in the late 60s and early 70s. But what's gone wrong now is the commitment to a world in which everyone is participating in this process of liberalizing and opening and engaging in some form of export-led growth, and led by the US, and with a stampede to break every rule at the from Washington. The story is that show me a rule in the WTO and I'll figure out how to break it. Caricature, but you see my point. For many years, the US's position had been as the hegemon in that previous circumstance, committed to the bottom row, not in green, but the old one. And what's more, committed to the MFN principle, centrally, no friendshoring. And a number of us have, in conversations, asked ourselves what it was that made the US so determined to institute MFN as a guiding principle to the trade regime. And it was probably the British Empire. That's my historical judgment, that because looking out, this is a group of countries who give each other special privileges. And we as the US don't want to face a world in which there are special privileges. And that was then. Now we're somewhere else. What does somewhere else look like? I'm sorry this picture is in yellow. I'm not very good at colouring my slides when I bring them from one set of slides to the other. There are essentially three sets of arguments parading in Washington at the minute about breaking the rules. And the first is what we teach our international economic students, you just don't do. The first is the Stolper-Samuelson theorem. If you have an import competing industry that's labor intensive in the US Rust Belt or in the Australian pre-liberalisation world, then protection is good for that, because Stolper-Samuelson theorem tells you that protection raises the real return of the factor used intensively in the import competing industry. And what we teach our students is you have to invent political economy ways of squaring off these damaged people when you reduce people whose fortunes have been compromised by liberalising. And my Australian story and our understanding of what happened in Australia during that period of Hawke-Keating liberalisation was an extraordinarily clear textbook case of this. You invent a productivity commission and you have inquiries and you understand who will suffer, and you devote federal funds to retraining and industrial opportunities and subsidies and whatever. and the argument from not just Trump, but I'm afraid the Democrats, is we just don't have the political economy in this country to do that. And because we don't, we are inevitably driven towards protectionist policies to defend the less well-off in our troubled economy. Let's use that word. That's the first set of arguments, which we as economists find unfortunate, but can understand for political economy reasons. The second and third use what we would call respectable pieces of economic theory, in some ways quite advanced economic theory, and the best person to articulate this case is Joe Stiglitz. And the second one is about innovation, that there is a market failure in the rewards to innovation are not fully captured. And we've all known this for a long time. The US has had institutions in the past which got around this. DARPA and the invention of all the high-tech world in the US was in some ways the 50s, 60s and 70s result of defense spending that understood all this. But it's become particularly urgent in the US now because China knows how to do this too, and there's now a competitor in this space. And the third is just dynamic comparative advantage, not innovation, but just economies of scale and learning by doing. And as Joe Stiglitz says as a way of explaining this argument, if Korea had listened to neoclassical economists, it would still be specialized in rice, because that's what seemed like the comparative advantage for that country at that time. And it's a caricature argument because it's not just applicable to Korea. The argument is a general one. But of course, this is now a terrible unraveling of the whole rules of the game. The yellow stuff I deliberately showed you as a problem in the 1970s, which was fixed by a replacement of full employment policy by inflation targeting and a move to floating exchange rates and a reconstitution of the system in such a way that it could be still made to work, led to the Great Moderation. And we're now all trying to understand how, in the face of the green challenges, this global order can be reconstituted. When there's friendshoring and all sorts of attacks on the fundamental rules of the game that we thought we needed. And the challenge summarized on this slide is to try and focus those arguments, and there are three of them: the political economy argument of defending those who are damaged by openness, and the innovation argument and the dynamic economies of scale argument. Try to focus policy responses to those in a way which was outward looking and focuses on protection of traded goods industry, support for traded goods industries in such a way as we could use technical language and say internalizes these externalities. But what we mean is simply makes it possible for the US in its particular case to feel that it's using appropriate policy in response to the challenges in this area that it's receiving from China. But of course, not only in the US, it's of course in Europe and in Australia. And I don't know the story of here, but I know that already this is happening in Australia. And the temptation is to end up exactly back where you don't want to go, with inward-looking rent seeking as a consequence of this industrial policy. Let's call it an epidemic. And as an economic theorist, in the middle of this political economy problem, there are two hugely important analytical questions, none of which we yet know how to answer. Neither of which. The first is that the basic rules of the WTO were built on Marshallian economics with perfect competition. Namely, here's an industry in which there's global trade, and there's a supply curve from some countries and the demand curve from other countries. And oh dear, there's a tariff that means that these curves don't intersect at their proper equilibrium. And our job as an organization is to try and get rid of this tariff so that we can get market clearing in this competitive market. And I know that that's the way James Mead thought about this as he drew up the rules for that became the GATT. And we all know that there was a lot of special and interesting discussion about what about particular privilege ensconced in regional free trade areas or customs unions. And this competitive theory was used to analyse trade diversion and trade creation and Mead and Viner and all that stuff. But you're only allowed to do that friendshoring complete and quickly. There was no this and that and my friends and your friends. And how are we going to deal with that? Which player, what game, fairness question, that's not a good word. Which country is allowed to be friends question. Secondly, there is the thought that we're now dealing in many parts of this international system with not Marshallian perfect competition at all, but large, very important oligopolistic industrial structures in which rent seeking is the task of the regulatory authority. Look at this, see a tariff and get rid of it. That's my job. Now look at this complicated, by comparison, oligopolistic structure with big rents. Who gets the rents? What's fair? First of all, the rents will probably go to the hegemon, which is doing the original invention. So fairness involves some subsidy to those who haven't been at the front of the game in the invention. So, and we have in our issue of OXREP a very interesting paper by Joe Stiglitz. That's why his picture was on this page, trying to discuss in a Rawls theory of justice sort of manner what kind of rules you would have for that. But you can see how horrendously difficult that is as a international political economy and institutional problem. And most of my friends just laugh and say, sorry, mate, we haven't had a Second World War just now, so nobody feels the urgency to deal with these complicated questions that they need. Nevertheless, that's our job to go on trying to think how to deal with them. I want to just list. I in the written paper go into much more detail the ways in which other bits of this policy policy matrix need to be reconfigured. There are within advanced countries sectoral issues which mean that just doing inflation targeting isn't enough because you have advanced sectors and sectors with poor people. So that framework has to be added to with a sectoral, structural concerned with inequality. In the international system, there is an ongoing discussion about where we're at with international capital flow management. And there's no clarity of this in the international. There's still what you might describe as civil war within the International Monetary Fund as an institution as to how far emerging market economies should be aspiring towards ending up with open, free international capital markets that the G7 have, and how far their nature as emerging market economies requires them to have institutional management of capital flows. There are a list of other important things to also consider. And again, I'm not going to think about them in any great detail. One is managing the transition to net zero, but you can see that's connected with the innovation issue I was talking about a minute ago. And there's the unfinished business of making the global health system safe in the face of the threat of the next pandemic. And still the restitution problem of the very great damage which has been done to many emerging market economies by the pandemic we've been through, many of whom are in a significant position of significant debt distress as a result of what they went through. Then, of course, finally, there's the rise of China. The position that I was describing previously had this story of opening of trade amongst countries led by a hegemon, the US, and looked a bit, and I showed this picture in an earlier slide, a bit like the one on the left-hand side here, one leader in relations with a number of followers. The minute you have two or more hegemons, the number of arrows on this diagram become extraordinarily large. And in particular, the task of figuring out the rules of the game becomes a competitive rules of the game story. Go right back to the APEC story that I told. There it was a matter of corralling a group of countries to agree that they were going to act in this way. And my caricature was a story of Bob Hawke giving a speech in Seoul. But more seriously, that was a system with a hegemon in Washington managing the leadership of this and the policing of the rules of the game. Try doing that competitively. It's not going to be easy. I just want to list four things on this slide as a way of concluding. The first is just to note how complex and difficult and indeterminate this process is likely to be. And I haven't got anything more in detail to say about that now. Secondly, I haven't yet mentioned the security argument for industrial policy. Those three reasons that I gave on this slide here were all economistic reasons, but there's also parading across this set of concerns a worry that trade in this particular commodity, namely chips, will give my security competitor, namely China, an advantage which I'm not prepared to cede. And so there are, what's the word I want, barriers coming down for security reasons in all sorts of ways. And trade economists now face the task internally in their political and civil service careers, tasks, jobs, of keeping the security people at bay who are determined to put up barriers here, there, and everywhere in a not very well justified way. Thirdly, there's the values issue. And Janet Yellen's friendshoring wasn't well explained as to whether it was to do with innovation or to do with economies of scale, or whether it was to do with security, or whether it was something else. And to do with values. And one of my colleagues, an international relations scholar, said to me in a chilling sort of way, which captures this concern, you know, I have colleagues in China who I now can't have a Zoom conversation with because they're frightened to talk to me about things that matter. Just imagine, David, if we all lived in 40 years' time in which our whole world was like this. Now, how to give focus to that concern, and there is a version of that focus, particularly run by international relations scholars in the US, which says that because of this fear, it is now our task to impede the economic growth of China. We see this as their capability and their purpose, and the way of preventing this is simply to use our industrial policy as a way of thwarting their growth process. And the minute that they say this, and they do, frankly, clearly, when they say this to you, you just reply, excuse me, think about Japan in the 1930s. This was the policy of the British Empire and of the US towards Japan in that time period. But we're now up against that set of discussions in the world order conversations of a kind that's really much harder to pin down than the ones I've been talking about up to now. And so finally, that raises the question of strategy in dealing, of course, particularly with China. What things are you prepared to cooperate about, and what things are you prepared not to cooperate about? And how can you run a mixed cooperative resistance system? And living in my bizarre University of Oxford, which has a matrix structure, I understand what it's like to run. We're all cooperating in being the University of Oxford, and it's very important that we are. But we are 40 separate colleges, each trying to do better than the other college in whatever metric we use. And one of the important metrics is how well your students do in the final exams. So imagine a university in which the teachers in this university are all trying to make their students do better than those taught by other teachers in the university in the exams. Now, that's a metaphor for the kind of international strategic discussions that there need to in the University of Oxford is very difficult to manage because there are some bits of central cooperative process which are university wide, and there are committees and they do that stuff, and there are other bits that are just collegiate fighting against each other for special privileges. And that's what we're now going to face with this world described by like that in having these kinds of discussions. Can I recommend a paper in the Oxrep issue that I've just edited by Danny Roderick and Stephen Walt, both from Harvard, who attempt to try and construct a framework of things you can talk about, things you can agree about, or just talk about, or not go near. And the ambition is to keep that as small as possible and to talk about things in such a way that you begin to realize that the things that you can then agree about. And that's a framework that has to be pursued, but you can see to conclude how much more difficult that's going to be than that discussion right back at the beginning when there was Britain. And I did say that there was conflict between the new hegemon and the old hegemon, but I also talked about how this conflict was basically resolved into constructing a framework, a set of institutions and the cooperative process. And I talked about the nature of leadership and the nature of cooperation, this concerted unilateralism idea. And I take all that as if you like, the roadmap from 60 years ago. But there are many rocks on the road now looking forward. And that's what I've been determined to show you in the last part of my talk. And we conclude by saying that the IR scholars are interesting because they look at all of what I've just been describing, and some of them say, you know what, there will be a war. And we're just describing the inexorable process of war between the US and China that exactly mirrors the war that there was between Britain and Germany in the First World War. And so that extremely determined conversation in the international regimes literature deploys all of what I've been putting in this talk and uses big analytical framework stuff to talk about that in a way which I think we can bring a useful contribution to as economists, because we have this particular equipment that I've been putting on the board with you. Secondly, I've already made clear just by saying that there are particular policy areas, lots of them I talked about, and there are these very broad regime questions, and we have to try and keep both of them in balance with each other. I've shown you how this multiple equilibrium can have a good equilibrium or a bad equilibrium. Framework is a much better way of thinking about what we're trying to do than a prisoner's dilemma framework. And looking ahead, a colleague of mine, Jonathan Freed from Canada, listened to me giving a depressing version of this talk and said, David, you haven't been quite fair enough. There are all sorts of bits of granularity of international cooperation that are in place and important. Think of the International Postal Union. Letters still get delivered. And then he went on listing very particular things. Think of the law of the sea, now resolved compared with where it was 40 years ago. Think of particular bits of public health, and the hopeful thought is that there is so much particularity still in place that this will continue to create a platform on which these other things can be built. Thanks very much.
Thank you, David. And so I'll go to questions soon. And so for those online, please put through some questions on Q&A. Just three sort of quick reflections from me. One was it was good to see the reference to the similarities in the health and the climate change space that you made. It was just one of the comments that also came through in the group chat, as you know, although we're talking about economics, how there's similarity. The second was the I think it's a Freudian slip, but the second to last bullet point there about we have to have a challenge of preserving exiting wisdom as opposed to existing wisdom. But you know, that's that is the core.
Both have to be in place.
Yeah, indeed. Yeah. And then just the third, and it's to steal your phrase for the session we're going to discuss later about glass half full and half empty one. The half empty one is, you know, it's for all the reasons you've outlined, it is a huge challenge, and you know, I know there wasn't anything in there in terms of, and so this is the way forward. But the glass half full side of it for me was by using a framework looking at, you know, a couple of pretty significant periods in history where you know, the global economic frameworks have broken down, yeah, and then rebuilt, sort of says, okay, well, it has been done before. It's different, but yeah. So that was my glass half full. But I will now, in the first instance,
very well put. Yes.
Yeah. In the first instance, I'll just go to the room to see if there's any questions here. And we've got a roving microphone, so we'll start over here. Thanks, Jeff.
Thanks very much for that. I love the idea of Gutierrez as a vice chancellor and the United Nations as congregation and all the countries as colleges. It calls to mind, though, the fact that what we really need here is an exercise in the economics of hegemony. And you are rather taking for granted what the objective function of hegemons and would-be hegemons actually is, and what are the constraints within which they operate. And I instinctively find myself wanting to go to industrial organisation thinking about this. In some market situations, natural monopoly will prevail, and or ones with network economics, for example, and one firm can indeed become the totally dominant player. In others, a stable oligopoly can prevail, and there are various games that firms can play in those oligopolistic settings. And it seems to me that, in a way, the first stage in thinking about this is to ask, what exactly are the objectives of the various hegemons that are playing the game? Secondly, what are the realistic constraints within which those objectives can be realised? And thirdly, to what extent do the hegemons or would-be hegemons themselves actually have a clear understanding of those constraints and are able to develop strategies that respect the constraints while maximising whatever it is they want to maximise. I have in mind here the difficulty of understanding precisely what, for example, Xi Jinping means when he advocates for a multipolar world. If you take him literally, he is talking about a world in which China coexists with the United States, both as major great powers and in some way dividing up the spoils of the world between them in a way that sustains the attractiveness of those spoils. And yet the conduct, not of the United States and of China, seems to point in a different direction from that. There are lots of historical cases of coexisting hegemons. Some of them are stable and some of them are not stable. And I'm tempted to start writing a political history of empire in the last 2,000 years to see what lessons can be drawn from it. But in a way, we're sort of in the late 19th century at the moment, with the race for empire underway, the colonisation process sweeping through Asia and Africa, the competing navies being built up, and the geopolitical picture darkening steadily. So in a way, the question I'm asking is, could we have avoided the First World War, if you sort of want to reduce it to something simple?
Is the chilling argument of Mearsheimer from Chicago, who runs that line brutally. And I recommend a quite wonderful debate which you can find on YouTube between him and Hugh White, Australian security specialist, and you type those names into Google and you get it. It's an hour long and is very valuable, and in which White attempts to answer at various stages more or less those questions that you've put in order to try and create a potential stable outcome as an alternative to the Mearsheimer inexorable go to war story. Just to take one technical point of what you made and did, the picture that I painted, I didn't talk about it very much but it was on my slide when I was presenting that APEC story, and under that in that slide I showed a story like, when I go backwards, you'll see why I'm doing this. Too far back. I said this was, as told by me, a story with symmetry between countries, just to make it simple. But underneath is a heading about the importance of hegemonic leadership, which I didn't explore in very much detail. But what I had in my mind there was a Stackelberg version of this, no longer symmetrical, but led by a leader, next slide on the right, running a whole lot of lines down in with the rules of the game with the followers. And what you point out is that Stackelberg is not the only way to think about this, that there are other ways of thinking which we can bring from industrial economics to think about the structure of the world order that we've created. And oligopolistic cooperation or warfare it is, I think, a very see what I'm doing and what you're doing. We're taking analytical tools from economics and we're using them to think about this big picture stuff that the international relations scholars have put in play. And I think that cross-fertilization is really very helpful.
Yeah, thank you for your presentation. I mean, you sensibly started from the Bretton Woods thing. I mean, that's the world as it was. But I wonder whether, I mean, Bretton Woods was founded, as you say, between the US and the UK, who had been on the same side in a conflict and still had a fundamentally similar view of the world.
Yeah.
I mean, in some ways, if I look at the current world, you could sort of think perhaps it's more like a situation where if the US in 1940 had decided, never mind about fighting the Germans, we'll sort of come to terms and try and find a global governance model and try to reconcile two completely different sort of world orders. So, I mean, is that a
very good question? One of my I gave a version of this. We had a seminar launching this issue at Chatham House in London a month ago. One of my closest friends who had a career at the IMF asked exactly this question. He said, sorry, David, I think that we should be thinking about 1941 when we didn't know whether we were going to beat the Germans. And thank you very sorry for all of you not getting that. We didn't know that it was just going to be us as the US hegemon taking over from the UK hegemon, and by saying that and locating the discussion in a more difficult time as a historical comparison, I think what you're doing is walking into the question that we've just been discussing and walking into that horribly complicated diagram that I drew later, which doesn't have just one hegemon, but lots of arrows going here, there, and everywhere. And it's much more difficult to think about. But so I'll press you and ask you, suppose, what should the US, had this conversation been happening in 1941, just after Roosevelt met Churchill, should they also have been discussing what should we do if we don't win? Is that what was implicit in your question?
It wasn't quite. I mean, it's an interesting question, but mine was just more the potential impossibility of a sort of global governance model. That's a sort of
because we don't know that we'll be like we were in
fundamental conflicts of values and maybe an irreconcilability.
That's why I really recommend having a look at the piece by Danny Roderick, who attempts to try and understand what a world with silos will look like, and the silos will look very different from the Cold War because Russia didn't trade with all the rest of it. The silos, however hard they try, have now got all these Apple firms stuck in China doing exporting, and that will, we think, go on more or less forever. So there's going to have to be, if there's not war, there's going to have to be an equilibrium which manages us dealing with people, roughly speaking, who are not our friends in relation to the values that they hold. Will be not easy.
Thank you. I'll now go to a couple of online questions and then come back into the room. So this one here, the question at the end is, is there too little diversity in policy development or decision-making areas? And they particularly focus in on, is there benefit to a tripartite participation involving governments, businesses and workers? Or more broadly, what or whose views are we currently missing in this global debate?
That's a very, very good question. I think I plead guilty to giving what has been basically a technocrat seminar, and so I think plead guilty. And I will. The only obvious thing but important thing to say is that as well as those international I'm pointing to the right-hand side of my diagram with those World Bank, IMF, World Trade Organization, big institutions. There are now very important NGO players in this space. And in each of the policy areas that these big institutions are responsible for, there are delivery organizations and mechanisms and procedures run by NGOs, and they will inevitably be part of this conversation. That's to say something terribly obvious, but it's also, I think, very important.
And then the next question, the context of it is quite long, so I won't go through all of it, and so I might miss the crux of it. But the question is really, what role, if any, do you see reindustrialization playing as a potential role in here, so that, in a post-Keynesian economics world, the idea that could reintroduce competition and therefore actually generate the growth and
reindustrialization of what? So I suppose to give this question focus, it's what future can we see in the opposite of outsourcing and what's the proper word? Outshoring. I've lost that word. And I think the answer is that it's important, but I've been very privileged to work closely with someone doing evolutionary biology who's actually a physiologist, a rather wonderful man, whose life's work was now in his 80s, building one of the really early computerized medical models of parts of the body, and his research was on the heart. And right back in the 60s, when computation was very difficult, he built a very, I want to say, million equation model of a pumping heart, and I think that's correct order of magnitude. And all of his work on that human organ has been what he would describe as belt and braces. He spent much of his time doing redundancy checks. If I knock this out, does the heart still keep beating? And the answer is he can knock out lots of things and the heart still keeps beating, because the evolutionary process has been to create resilience by redundancy. And so he has laughed and laughed and laughed at the way in which just-in-time supply chain management has been organized by modern international capitalism. And the opposite to that is diversity of supply, and diversity of supply will involve bringing some things back home. And I actually think that the process of bringing things back home will create a sense of greater understanding for what's being done. It's hard to talk about this in the abstract, but just imagine a particular commodity that has some inputs that are sourced from around the world, some of which you bring back home. In the process of bringing them back home, you necessarily create a clearer understanding of the whole process of making this product and putting it together and its components and your knowledge of how it works and its resilience and its sustainability. what I'm saying is that I think not only might you bring engineering tasks back home, but in the process you might also bring a greater amount of understanding back home. And I think both of these things will be important.
Thank you, Professor, for an excellent explanation of the liberal world order from Bretton Woods, basically describing how Europe and North America divided up the world to suit themselves. I'm just following on from that. If we're looking at the next 50 or 60 years, given that most of the world's population lives in Africa and Asia, do you think that there could be much more of a role for less aligned entrepôts like perhaps Singapore and the UAE to play a role in the new world order and how people trade with each other?
The answer has to be yes, but how yes works, I'm not quite sure about, because the most successful international organization has been the IMF, which has been, I was going to say brutally hegemonic in the way it's been managed as an organization. Much less successful as an organization has been the WTO. There are all sorts of reasons for that, but one of them is the absence of the capacity, because it's a consent organization. There's been the absence of the ability to do vertical managerial control, and the World Bank's in somewhere in between these two organizations in its structure. I suppose I think that was basically an evasive paragraph while I collect my wits. The proper thing to say is I think the G20, because the G20 has been an organization which has tried to pass responsibility around and pass leadership around, and very deliberately hasn't been constructed as a place with us. There isn't an office block somewhere in Pakistan that is the center of, or wherever, that is the center of the G20. It's perpetually in motion in order to bring collaboration into process. But that's also still an evasive answer, because the sorts of countries in that process are one stage bigger than the rather remarkable UAE and Singapore small players. I suppose the answer is that these small players have a capacity to punch above their weight, which can be very, very important. I think Singapore has done that. I don't quite understand how Dubai and the Arab nations are attempting to do this and how successful they're being. But I think the history of Singapore in bringing together important things that have happened in that region and beyond is really very both remarkable and important. And so I'd say, and I think that allies with that and the G20 are I think the two attempts to give an answer to your question.
Just building on that one a little bit with a question online, and then I'll go to Caleb for the final question in the room. So talking about UAE, Singapore, like, they're already sort of forming as, central powers. With the, sort of the South-South balance, what's your thoughts on how New Zealand and Australia can take advantage, or to the extent we should be engaging more in Southeast Asia in general, or South America as other bodies to try and shape this up?
Hugely. I know almost nothing about New Zealand's history, I'm afraid. I'm very close to a tourist on that score. Yeah. But I think of Australia as having achieved during that Hawke-Keating period a real ability to punch above its weight. And I'm going to turn the question backwards, because I now live in Britain, which is a country that has found it extraordinarily difficult to come to terms with the fact that it's now not the global imperial hegemon for which everyone has to bow down and obey. And that's a sort of a caricature of why the Brexit negotiations went so badly, because the people doing them from the British side still seem to believe that they just had to say something and these silly Europeans would recognize that they had to do it. What I think countries like Australia can teach other countries like Britain is that you can find ways of punching above your weight in particular issues. I talked about APEC, but Australia and the Uruguay round were really important in helping bring together the primary commodity exporters as a bloc. And so I ask, where is the global South now as having a capacity to do that? And I've published in this issue of OxRep a paper by a very interesting paper by some colleagues from Brazil, who concluded that the global South is so fragmented at the moment that it has very little capacity to act in this way. And they were partly using the international confusion in relation to the war in Ukraine as to whose side everyone ends up believing they belong on, and how they can cooperate or not cooperate in a strategy in relation to that war. So I think there's a real opportunity, but I think the challenge is that the interests of countries across, just look at the map, Africa and South and Southeast Asia and Latin America, the interests of these, think of 3 blocks of players, as so significantly different that finding a particular issues, but isn't that the answer? The task is for the leaders of that group of countries in the world to find particular issues on which they can corral collective interest and push.
I might just wrap us up there. It's approaching 3 o'clock. And we all do this. We talk about, the New Zealand view, the Australian view. We have a coalition government here in New Zealand with three parties, and so trying to get what their common view is. Yeah. But I always go from the perspective of, let's start with the common ground, and I quite like that 3-phase. 3 buckets of what are the things we agree on, what are the things we can discuss, and what are the things that we can't talk about, and doing everything you can to keep that small. I'm actually going to take that home with me tonight, and build on that. So thank you very much, David. That was really good, and thank you everyone, both online and in the room, for the questions. In terms of our next seminar, so that's the Friday the 26th, we'll be hearing from Ngaire Woods, Dean of Blavatnik School of Government at the University of Oxford. So again, another Yes, indeed. So Ngaire will explore government strategy in a world of economic nationalists. It'll be another hybrid event with Ngaire presenting here in person. And so please keep an eye out for that, and other updates in here. Again, just another plug for that long-term insights briefing. And so finish with a karakia, piki te kaha, piki te ora, piki te wairua, hui e, taiki e. Ka kite anō.